Welcome to Things You Don't Know. This episode covers a topic that was actually suggested to me by my oldest biological son. I adopted two other children before him. My oldest biological son, Christopher, who is one of the smartest persons, I've ever known. Christopher has recently suffered serious injuries in a vehicular accident. And I do dedicate this episode to him.
Today, we've got a fascinating story that bridges 2,500 years of history. We'll be talking about Lucius Quintus Cincinatus, an ancient Roman statesman, and how he's connected to the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Yes, that's Cincinnati.
If you've ever wondered why a Midwestern city carries such a classical name, or what a Roman farmer turned dictator has to do with American civic ideas and ideals, you're in the right place. We're diving into Cincinatus' historical significance, his influence on civic virtue, and how his legacy inspired the name and identity of Cincinnati, which, by the way, I am currently in Cincinnati. So it was sort of interesting for me to have some of this revealed to me.
Our dear friend Leslie Finelli, who's been on some other podcasts, also was born and raised there. It's an amazing city. We're also going to chat about some very big thinkers, Cicero, Machiavelli, Rousseau, and how they were inspired by Cincinnatus's example of duty and leadership. So we've got ancient Rome, the founding of America, philosophy, and a bit of humor along the way. Ready to get started?
Hey, yeah, sure, absolutely. Let's set the stage for our story in the introduction. Then we'll move on to who was Cincinnatus, explore the influence on Cincinnati, Ohio, connect them to related thinkers, and wrap it up with closing thoughts and takeaways. Now, on to the legend of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, and if you look down and if you get pictures, you'll see that I managed to secure a picture. It's not an actual picture; it's a drawing, painting, because obviously they didn't have cameras back then. But Cincinnatus is portrayed as a humble farmer called to leadership in this neoclassical painting, which I mentioned, painted by Juan Ribera in 1806. The artwork shows Roman messengers offering him the dictatorship as he stands with his plow and oxen, embodying the ideal of reluctant leadership. Such images underscore how deeply his story of duty and humility resonated through the ages, inspiring tons of people and later generations. So, okay, who was Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus? Picture this. It's around 458 BC in the Roman Republic. Rome is in trouble. An enemy has trapped the Roman legions. The Senate frantically needs a leader to save the day. Their legion was surrounded. They were facing annihilation. To whom did they turn? A retired statesman named Cincinatus, whom whom they found plowing his fields on his small farm. Yeah, literally. The legend says he was working on his farm when the call to serve came.
That's right. Roman officials show up and basically say, drop your plow, Rome needs you. Cincinnatus, probably bewildered and covered in dust, asks his wife to fetch his toga. You got to dress the part, right? They declare him dictator, which in the Roman Republic was a temporary emergency leader with near absolute power. It's very different from what we think of as a dictator today. No pressure, Cincinnati.
So Cincinnatus leaves his farm duties behind and takes charge of the army. He famously tells every able bodied Roman to gather in arms with 5 days of provisions. He then marches out to rescue the trapped Roman forces. In a swift campaign, he defeats Rome's enemies in just over 2 weeks. Talk about some efficiency. 16 days? Wow. Talk about that. That, according to the legend, it was within 15 days, I guess, not 16, that the crisis was over.
And here's the kicker. Cincinnati didn't even use his full customary 6-month term as dictator. And once he secured victory and celebrated a triumph in Rome, saying prayers to the gods, he promptly resigned his absolute power on the 16th day and went straight back to his farm and his plow. He was like, all right, crisis solved. I'm out. I've got crops to tend to.
That act, stepping down voluntarily, is what made Cincinnati a legendary model of virtue. The Romans were amazed that someone given ultimate power would willingly give it up so quickly. Later Roman writers praised how he held power not a day longer than absolutely necessary. He really showed honor and integrity. He became the poster child, so to speak, for civic duty, putting the needs of the Republic above his own personal ambition.
It's such a good story that even if some of it might have been embellished by historians like Levy, as a historian myself, I admit that does happen, the meaning still shines through. Cincinnati embodied the idea that leadership is a duty, not a prize. He didn't just cling to power or riches. In fact, he was considered quite poor by the standards of the Roman elite. He just did his job and went home. Fun fact, the name Cincinnati actually means curly-haired in Latin. So he was literally the curly-haired guy who saved the Roman Republic.
Yeah, he wasn't done after one heroic episode either. Years later, tradition says Cincinnatus was called to serve again around 439 BC to deal with a conspiracy in Rome. Even as an older man, he answered the call of duty to stop a would-be tyrant, showing that his commitment to the Republic hadn't faded. All in all, he had this happen, according to the legends, a total of 3 different times. So once the crisis passed, he returned to private life again. Talk about consistency.
Ancient Romans like Cicero absolutely loved this stuff. They look back at Cincinatus as a shining example of what they called the mos merim, the way of the ancestors, meaning the virtues that made Rome great, farming your own land, serving your country when needed, and not overstaying your welcome in power. Cincinatus was the ideal citizen soldier, humble, dutiful, and selfless.
Yeah, exactly. So in short, Cincinnatus was a farmer, statesman who became a legend for saving Rome and then walking away from power on his own accord. This humility and devotion to the public good made his name forever synonymous with civic virtue. Civic virtue. And that reputation didn't stay in ancient Rome. It echoed, reverberated through the ages, which leads us to how his legacy crossed the Atlantic and landed in unimaginable places in Ohio.
Now for the big connection. How did an American city end up named Cincinnati in the first place? To answer that, we have to jump forward about 2,000 years to the late 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution. After the Revolution, a group of veterans formed an organization called the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783. The Society's members were officers of the Continental Army, and they chose to name their group after Cincinatus himself. That tells you how much they admired his ideals. After the Bible, Greek and Roman history and myths were the foundation of education in those days. The Society of the Cincinnati, established in 1783, is the United States' oldest patriotic hereditary society. It was founded by officers of the Continental Army to commemorate the American Revolutionary War and to, quote, promote the principles for which they had fought. Membership was originally limited to officers who had served at least 3 years in the Continental Army or Navy, or until the end of the war, including officers of our French allies and the French Navy above certain ranks. Notable original members include General George Washington, our first president and the Society's inaugural President General, Lieutenant Colonel James Monroe, himself the fifth President of the United States, Major General Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury and the Society's second President General, his rival, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Burr, the third Vice President of the United States, the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocratic military officer who fought in the American Revolutionary War. Regarding Thomas Jefferson, he was not a member of the Society of the Cincinnati. In fact, Jefferson, along with other founding leaders like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, was highly suspicious of the organization's motives, fearing it could lead to the establishment of a hereditary nobility in the new republic. He saw it as a bauble given out like knighthoods in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Why Cincinatus? Because these American officers, fresh from securing independence, saw themselves in his story. They had fought for the Republic. And like Cincinatus, most planned to return to civilian life rather than to seize power. Good old George Washington, was their role model. Most people are familiar with his notion when he famously resigned as commander of the army when the war was won. Despite people asking him to stay on, offering him a monarchy of sorts, people at that time actually called Washington the American Cincinatus. He embodied the same virtues by giving up the chance to be king.
And get this, Washington was the first President General of the Society of the Cincinnati. When he left his commission at the end of the Revolutionary War, his rival, George III, King of the UK, said, if he gives up power, he will be the greatest man in history. So the Society's name was a direct homage to the Roman who gave up the sword for the plow. It was as much a tribute to Washington's character as to the ancient legend. In fact, the Society's insignia, a golden eagle, features Cincinnatus on it, depicted receiving a sword from Roman senators and then returning to his farm just to drive the point home.
A few years later in our timeline here in 1790, this all ties into the city. There was a little settlement on the Ohio River, originally called Losantiville. Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory and also a member of the Society of Cincinnati, decided the name just wouldn't do. And so on January the 2nd, 1790, he officially renamed Losantiville as Cincinnati in honor of the Society of the Cincinnati. Essentially, the new city's new name paid tribute to the ideals of Cincinatus that the society stood for.
So the city of Cincinnati is literally named after Cincinatus. It's like saying, this is the city of the people who value what Cincinnati stood for. The etymology is straight up classical. Cincinnati is the plural Latin form, meaning followers of Cincinnatus or members of the Cincinnati Society. This wasn't just a random choice. It was meant to inspire the new American nation with a connection to the virtues of the Roman Republic.
And the influence doesn't stop at the name. You know, if you come to visit Cincinnati, Ohio today, you'll find references to its namesake. There is a statue of Cincinnatus along the Ohio River at Sawyer Point. In that statue, he's shown returning his sword and picking up a plow, symbolizing how he gave power back to the people and went back to farming. Now, that statue was actually a gift from the city of Rome, Italy, honoring the connection. The city's identity has been tied to this idea of civic virtue, really from the beginning. It hasn't always been perfect, but it's an ideal.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. A farmer from ancient Rome inspiring the founders of our nation, Revolutionary War heroes, and lending his name to a city in the American heartland. It speaks to how universal and timeless the ideal of selfless leadership is. Early Americans wanted their leaders to be like Cincinatus, courageous in crisis and modest in victory. And naming a city Cincinnati was like a hope that the citizens and leaders there would live up to that example.
So next time somebody jokes about Cincinnati's odd name and weird spelling, that's Cincinnati. Weird, huh? You can tell them it comes from a man who twice or three times, depending which legends you want to follow, saved his republic and refused to make himself ruler for life. That heritage is literally written on the city's map. Now, Cincinnati may be famous for chili, which Cincinnati chili I think sucks, but okay. And baseball. They love their baseball here. But beneath that is a proud legacy linked to one of the greatest examples of republic virtue in history.
Cincinnati just didn't inspire city founders and George Washington. His story also influenced great philosophers and political thinkers who have grappled for millennia with questions of duty, leadership, and how to run a republic. Let's talk about a few, starting with Marcus Tullius Cicero, the famous Roman orator and philosopher.
Now, Cicero lived a few centuries after Cincinnatus, during the downfall of the Roman Republic. And he often looked back to those old heroes for inspiration. In one of Cicero's writings, he actually references Cincinatus by name. noting the story of how Cincinatus was plowing his field when called to serve as dictator. Cicero praised the days when statesmen were also humble farmers. I mean, the picture that I get with this, I mean, we've had a few presidents that were farmers. Um, Most recently, Jimmy Carter, who passed away here recently, peanut farmer. I remember when he was running, they made a lot of fun of that. Oh, the peanut farmer, and though he didn't just lay down the mantle after that, I think he was okay with it because he did a whole lot of things after that that said, yeah, I believe in this republic. So guys like Cincinatus, who would have found, who would be found at the plow until duty called them to high offices, is praiseworthy, as Cicero said. To Cicero, Cincinnatus embodied the virtue of putting the common good first. A, not giving the money to the rich, because he wasn't rich, but doing something for the people, the middle class, which I see quickly disappearing here these days. He championed the idea that no life is more honorable than one spent helping the republic and the people. And Cincinnatus' life was a prime example of that ideal.
I strongly encourage you to check out our Carter podcast to get some more modern examples of that public spirit. But moving forward in time to the Renaissance, we're looking at Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli is often remembered only for his guide to realpolitik, The Prince, and cunning and somewhat unethical politics. But he also wrote a book called Discourses on Leaving, where he praised the Roman Republic. Machiavelli recounts the story of Cincinnati saving Rome when it was in grave danger, and then surrendering power to return to his villa, a little farm, afterward. Machiavelli held up Cincinnati as the model of humility and civic virtue. His poverty and a simple life were seen as virtues that future Romans tried and should try to emulate. In Machiavelli's eyes, the greatness of the Roman Republic came from leaders who, like Cincinatus, served selflessly, did what they could, and then stepped aside. It is a pretty glowing shout out from a usually cynical and shrewd political analyst.
Indeed, you are right. I'm reminded, since this is dedicated to my son, Christopher, he kind of embodies some of those things too. Always helping people, looking for ways to help others, not just in the moment, but helping them to form different thoughts, to think different ways. Machiavelli, even nasty Machiavelli, in so many ways, said, look, Cincinnati did it right. He even uses Cincinnati to argue that sometimes you need strong, decisive leadership, a dictator in the old sense of the word, not the kind of dictator that we have today, to save the republic. But crucially, only until the job is done. After that, a leader must give power back. Other people, individuals, can be lifted up. Machiavelli admired the balance of strength and restraint. It's a lesson in leadership. And, we see the downside of this happening all the time with people who are unfortunate, people who have exceptionalities seems to be the first thing that people see instead of, and I know, Dr. Deneen, this has happened to you, where people see you in a wheelchair and think, oh, he's just a cripple. And I say, screw them.
Well, I'm very grateful for you, for Leslie and Dr. Kramer and many of the other wonderful people I've mentioned on these podcasts who look beyond that and who enabled me to rise out of temporary despair and to see the positives and the blessings in my life.
That's because of who you are inside.
Well, you mentioned your son Christopher's efforts to help people and to give the best of what he had, and I know from your example where he gets it from. Can I just say so? And returning to Cincinatus, we're also looking at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an Enlightenment philosopher in the 18th century around the time of our American founders. Rousseau's most famous work is A Social Contract. And interestingly, he devotes a chapter in it to the Roman institution of temporary dictatorship. He gives a surprisingly positive spin on the Roman dictatorship, citing how it protected public liberty in emergencies. When Rousseau talked about this, he had examples like Cincinatus in mind. The good dictators who use extraordinary power to save the state and willingly relinquish it. I think of President Lincoln during the Civil War, even temporarily suspending habeas corpus, went against everything he believed in, but he felt he had to do it that the country might survive.
Rousseau argued that in a republic, there are times of crisis when the normal laws might need to be silenced briefly to save the nation. But that this must be done without destroying the republic's freedom. Cincinatus was the poster child for that idea. He was a dictator who didn't become a tyrant. In fact, Rousseau and others drew a sharp line between dictatorship and tyranny. A tyrant, as they said, seizes power for himself. Whether a Roman-style dictator whereas a Roman-style dictator like Cincinatus was given power by the people or the Senate to defend freedom and then gave it back, believing that other individuals had something more to give than what you see on the surface sometimes. Rousseau loved that concept because it showed that power itself isn't evil. It's how long you hold on to it and for whose benefit. And I think also remembering that every individual has their own goodness, their own things. But so often we just look at what we can get for ourselves and we don't look at what we can get for the society, this is a community here, in the United States. It should be. It isn't right now. I know that. But perhaps we can learn.
So through Cicero, Machiavelli, Rousseau, we could mention others like Livy, who first recorded the tale, or George Washington's contemporaries. The thread is that Cincinnati symbolizes the ideal leader in a republic. He's the benchmark in discussions of good leadership in knowing when to take power in a crisis, but as you said, Dr. Weaver, when to let it go. I think of Washington in our own country, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Anwar Sadat in Egypt. These were men who came to power in great times of crisis and could have been given anything they asked for. But they knew when it was time to go back to their ordinary life. And Sadat, as with many other great leaders, paid with his life for his beliefs in peace. So Cicero sees Cincinatus as the virtuous elder statesman, Machiavelli as the model dictator who saved the state, and Rousseau as proof that even emergency powers if not kept around forever and more than necessary, can serve freedom if done right.
Yes, as you say, freedom, if done right. You know, it's fascinating to see how the same story spoke to people across centuries. Whenever folks worried about leaders getting too power hungry, some of them might say, remember Cincinatus? That's how it should be done. Even in recent times, in some circles, you'll hear the reference pop up. For example, when leaders step down or refuse to extend their power, commentators sometimes compare them to Cincinatus returning to his plow. The name is shorthand for integrity in leadership. Now, I don't know how many people actually have even heard of this story. I kind of doubt that there's many, but hopefully the word can get out and people can take it as an example and a way to move forward.
We've covered quite a lot here, from a Roman farm's field to the founding of Cincinnati, Ohio, from ancient philosophers to Enlightenment thinkers. What are the big takeaways here?
You know, one key insight is that good leadership is timeless. Cincinnati's story might be 2,500 years old, but it still resonates. It teaches that holding power is not about personal glory, it's about duty and service. True leaders step up when their community or country needs them. And just as importantly, step back down when the mission is accomplished and support the idea of other individuals giving what they can, not telling somebody what you can give, but recognizing what they do give, not seeing always just deficits, but seeing abilities too. You know, that idea influenced how Americans thought about their own leaders. We see it in George Washington's voluntary retirement. And that, of course, drew explicit comparisons to Cincinnati.
As a historian, friends, a thought popped into my head, so I'm just going to share it with you briefly. I'm sorry, it's one of the vices of my profession. In 1931, the Romanian people were suffering with two extreme political parties, Iron Cross fascists that were seen as even worse than the Nazis, at least in the beginning, and Stalinist communists fighting out the streets. Romania had a king, Carol II, and he temporarily suspended the constitution, put the leaders of both these extreme movements in prison, and restored a democratic system in a couple of years. That's an example of a Cincinnati for a more modern time. But another takeaway from the story is the power of symbolism in civic identity. Naming a city in a brand new United States, the city of Cincinnati after Cincinnati, wasn't just flattery to an ancient Roman. It was seen as a statement of values. It said that this new city inspires at its best the Roman virtues of courage, humility, and public service. The fact that Cincinnati, 200 odd years later, still honors Cincinnati with symbols, statues, and of course its very name, shows how a legend can shape the identity of a place. It is history at its best, inspiring the present.
We also see how ideas connect through history. The virtues Cicero wrote about, Machiavelli analyzed, and Rousseau philosophized over, all of them found a concrete example in Cincinnati. It's a reminder that storytelling, like Levy's story of Cincinnati, can influence real political thought and even the course of nations. Sometimes a single powerful example, the man who gave up power, the man who gave up power, not the one who assumed it, can be more influential than dozens of abstract theories when it comes to guiding people's beliefs.
And let's not forget, it's also just an inspiring story on a human level. A simple farmer is given ultimate authority at a great crisis and handles it without becoming corrupt and without losing his moral compass. In an era when we often see people clinging to power, Cincinnati is a refreshing contrast. It challenges us today. Would we have the character to do what he did? It's something leaders and citizens alike can ponder.
You know, yeah, we've covered a lot, and but before we sign off, we, I have to say, I really love that somewhere in Cincinnati there might be some curly-haired kid learning that their city is named after a curly-haired Roman hero. You know, history does have a sense of humor like that, and hopefully, if that happens, hey, something else good might happen too. Somebody might want to emulate that, huh?
Absolutely. And I think Cincinnati would approve of that legacy. He wanted to be remembered not for wealth or titles, but for doing his duty. I'd say mission accomplished. We're still talking about him and using his example centuries later.
So, whether you're in Cincinnati or anywhere else, the story of Cincinatus offers a timeless lesson. Lead with duty and honor, and don't overstay your welcome in power just for your own personal good and glorification. It's a standard that leaders from ancient Rome to modern America have been held against.
Thank you for joining us on this journey from Rome to Ohio. We hope you found it as engaging and enlightening as we did. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give us a like, and leave us a review. And feel free, as always, to share any thoughts or questions. Maybe you'll even impress your friends by explaining the origin of Cincinnati's name.
Hey, until next time, stay curious and remember, sometimes the greatest triumph is having the wisdom to step back and let somebody else shine. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.